And now, the next story. She stormed into my backyard as if she owned the entire town, heels digging into the ground, waving a piece of paper above her head. "This is official," she bellowed. "You need to pay the HOA $1 million for breaking community rules." She waved the fine in my face as if it were a death warrant. I wanted to laugh, but I did not. I merely sat on my porch, unruffled fingers together, observing her tremble with rage. "We're just worried about the safety of our children," she explained, wiping at her eyes with a tissue. "That dam is about to break, and we've got families living directly downstream from it." One of the humorous things about local news is they like a good story, but aren't always good at follow-up investigation. Had they taken the time to look, they would have discovered that Midam had recently passed safety inspection with flying colors. But Maggie wasn't finished. She put up on the Nextdoor app. You know, that virtual neighborhood watch where HOA presidents like to flex their petty power? Her message advertised threatening property claims and volatile people in the neighborhood. She never said my name, but she didn't need to. In that small community, everybody knew who she meant. The scent of diesel fumes and cedar pollen filled the air in August. As I gazed out at their construction workers giving double shifts every night, working to complete those homes before I could file any sort of legal injunction, I tallied new foundation pours every night. I watched the water level in Pop's Dam fall another inch every night. That's when I phoned my retired Army friend Tony Riggs, who presently works for the EPA Enforcement Branch. 20 minutes on the telephone with Tony learned me more about environmental law than 3 hours with that pricey lawyer. Tony explained that if they're intercepting a natural watercourse without federal permits, that's a Clean Water Act offense. And if my dam is a federal jurisdiction, he didn't have to complete the sentence. I began recording all of it. Trail cameras along the perimeter of the property dated photographs of each water diversion. Flow levels at 3 locations down the creek. My sister Sarah phoned from California, pleading with me to simply take the money and leave. This was no longer about money, though it was about the crunch of gravel beneath construction boots that didn't belong on my land. It was about the click of Maggie S. heels on courthouse marble for zoning hearings that never should have been held. It was about the acrid flavor of courthouse coffee. It was about the hours spent studying the extent of this corruption. It was about that dam, though. Pops constructed it to benefit the community in times of drought. For 45 years, it had provided sustenance for our downstream neighbors. Maggie's crew was converting it into a McMansion decorative pond. My last HOA in Houston had settled an EPA fine for a $2.3 million identical creek diversion scam. She'd fled town, just in front of the federal prosecutors, and established business here in Austin, seeking new victims. In the meantime, Maggie was spreading lies about my mental illness and violent behavior. She hired a private detective to uncover scandal about my time in the service, and put out a petition calling for the city to condemn my house as a public nuisance. "We have children who play in these neighborhoods," she said to the hometown newspaper. "We can't have erratic people making us feel threatened." But while she was indispensable playing the victim, I was forging alliances. I spoke with other HOA victims online and found a pattern. Maggie's HOA had gobbled up 6 smaller properties using the same methods over the last 3 years. Every time, it was the same routine. Pressure, harassment, bureaucratic battles, and unexplained zoning changes that always paid off for Rick's construction company. I teamed up with my elderly neighbor, Mrs. Chun, whose family garden had dried out since the creek diversion. I met Miguel Santos, whose family farm had been rezoned out of business by Rick Thornwell 2 years prior. These were not random occurrences. They were part of a systematic land grab that had been taking place for years. When you build a house in a flood zone and don't tell the insurance company, that's fraud. When you make an insurance claim based on that fraud, that's also fraud. When the floodwaters hit your neighbor's property, that's negligence. And when you bribe the building inspector to overlook the necessary permits, that's also probably fraud. So as I stood there watching another concrete truck rumble down past my kitchen window, I realized something important. This wasn't going to be one in a courtroom with high-priced lawyers and legal briefs. This was going to be one in engineering. My neighbor thought she was going to intimidate me by cutting off my water access. She should have known I grew up on a farm. We don't need municipal water out here. We collect rainwater, drill our own wells, and we treat our own wastewater. My septic system might not be connected to the city sewer, but it is permitted and inspected. By the time Maggie cut off my water, I had already filed my own complaint with the state, and the investigator assigned to my case was a former Texas Ranger named Carl. He was grizzled and taciturn, the kind of man you didn't want to have as an enemy. By the time he finished his investigation, my neighbor had added code violations for every conceivable offense. Apparently, she believed that owning the HOA meant that she owned the town. Carl paid her a visit, and I heard rumors that he was sitting in a garage pointing a gun at her while he talked about her violations. "You can shut off my water, Maggie, but you'll be arrested for it." She ended up paying the fines and my water was turned back on before the week was over. But that wasn't the end of it. There were enough violations to revoke her permit. And when the state shows up to take away your building permit, that's when the real trouble starts. Her permit was revoked and her corporation dissolved. Within a few months, she was gone. Taking her toxic positivity and toxic waste with her, there's a reason why Texas is called the Lone Star State. Everyone thinks they can come into my backyard and take my star. They're wrong! And they'll pay for it! If you think you can walk onto my land and steal my water, you're dead wrong. And you will regret it for the rest of your life. Texas grand juries hand out indictments faster than you can say and the indictments piled up against my neighbor. She learned what I already knew, that the right to water in Texas is stronger than any other property right. But she also learned that sometimes you need to fight back in a different language. In Texas, you don't need a lawyer. You need an engineer. Maggie thought she was so clever, so ingenious. But in the end, she set up the perfect photo op for me. What was it? 20 worried mothers with children standing right by my boundary, their faces etched with worry. A keen photographer was behind the lens capturing every anxious face in my farmhouse, looming like a dark specter in the background. It was brilliant. And if that wasn't enough, the Facebook status message was a killer. It included a hashtag protect our kids. "Our kids are entitled to safe neighborhoods," she told the Channel 7 reporting team. Not whatever problems he brought home from war. And there it was, in black and white, proof that my nemesis understood one thing about me. I did come back from war with something. I came back with the skills to recognize when somebody is trying to steamroll you and the engineering acumen to do something about it. That same day, Tony Riggles called with news that turned everything upside down. The EPA had already launched a federal investigation of Willow Creek diversions based on my initial report. But here's the thing. Maggie's past HOA in Houston had that $2.3 million fine for the same scam. Federal environmental crimes have a way of catching up with people even when they move to other jurisdictions. While Maggie was busy being a martyr on social media, I was discovering her whole house of cards regarding money was built on fraud. The HOA's building loans have been secured against inflated property values and guaranteed access to water. And that last part was crucial. The banks had demanded it in order to issue the loans. And if those water rights reverted back to me, their rightful owner, the entire complex would be financially underwater. I'll admit, the irony wasn't lost on me. They deappropriated my water to make their land worth something. And now greed was going to sink them. In a panic, Maggie made me an offer, $400,000 cash, no questions asked. 48 hours, or else, when I refused, she flew to California and tried to hit up my sister Sarah with some sob story about her brother's supposed mental instability. But that plan also blew up in her face. Sarah may not know Texas land law, but she knows her brother. She called me hysterical. Jake, some lunatic woman in tennis attire, just tried to tell me that our mentally unstable brother was threatening her. I told Sarah, if Maggie bothers us again, I'm calling the FBI. Meanwhile, while Maggie alienated people, I was alienating them for our side. I teamed up with environmental attorney Amanda Croce, who specializes in pro bono water rights cases. We joined forces with downstream farmers who'd been impacted by the creek diversion. Miguel Santos showed me historical records proving his family had used the creek water for agriculture since 1887. Mrs. Chun showed me 1940s photographs of her grandfather's garden, also irrigated by the same creek now supplying Maggie's ornamental water features. The Audubon Society, local to the creek, were especially interested to hear that the creek diversion had eliminated essential breeding grounds for a number of protected bird species. Turns out killing protected wildlife while stealing water tends to get federal attention real fast. On my nighttime scouting mission, I found the remnants of army habits. What I discovered was more than an earthwork dam. The original 1978 plan included an emergency spillway system with hydraulic gates that had seen daylight since 1982. The empty sound of water running through those underground spillway tunnels when I tested them at midnight spoke volumes. The system was still intact, and it was built for precisely this kind of situation. Flooding under control to replicate natural flow patterns of water. I figured out how much water it would take to get Willow Creek back into its natural course. 2.8 million gallons. The dam was holding 3.1 million gallons as of the recent rainstorms. The arithmetic was beautiful, but the timing had to be impeccable. I used my drone for overhead scouting to plot out the precise positions of those new foundation houses in relation to the natural creek bed. 5 homes were constructed right in the old flood channel. 3 others had basements beneath the seasonal high water level. And here's the nice part. The construction companies had put in decorative creek beds made of concrete and stones. They were nice looking, but they weren't intended to flow with real water. Meanwhile, my spillway system was designed by the Army Corps just for managing floods. And then Maggie committed her biggest blunder. Her workers started placing permanent concrete barriers to completely seal off the creek bed. This would render my spillway system irrelevant and permanently damage the downstream environment. But it also provided the ideal pretext for what I was to do. The weather forecast was calling for heavy September rains, ideal seasonal camouflage for emergency dam repairs. Standing there at the sunset at those spillway levers, reading Pop's journal entry on assisting neighbors in times of drought, the choice became clear. It was my duty to make room for the coming flood. As I rummaged through old courthouse files for the 3rd time that week, I unearthed a misplaced document that turned the entire case around. Hiding underneath a pile of 1979 tax levies was the original Agricultural Flood Control Covenant of Pop S Dam Construction. The wording was elegant in its brevity. Dam operators shall ensure natural seasonal flow patterns in order to maintain downstream agricultural water rights forever. This wasn't simply authorization to regulate flooding. It was a legal obligation that superseded any HOA agreements or city ordinances. Amanda Cross's probe revealed something much worse. The HOAS insurance forms included outright falsehoods. They stated no seasonal flood hazard and permanent creek diversion approved by all authorities to get $47 million in coverage. The local paper published a smear piece that had me coming across like a domestic terrorist of some sort. Troubled Vet Holds Back Community Progress was the title, accompanied by a photograph that somehow made my farm appear to be a crack house and me to look like I had eons slept in days. But Maggie's coup de grace was the photo opportunity. She set it up to perfection. 20 worried mothers standing with children along my property line with a professional photographer, taking pictures of their anxious faces as my farmhouse threatened ominously in the background. The Facebook post went viral with the hashtag #ProtectOurKids. Our children need safe neighborhoods, she said to the Channel 7 news team. Not whatever problems he brought back from war. You know what? She was correct on one thing. I did bring something home from war. I brought home the skill of knowing when someone is attempting to steamroll you with propaganda and the engineering expertise to do something about it. Tony Riggs phoned with news that turned everything around. The EPA had initiated a federal investigation into diversions of Willow Creek based on my original complaint. But the kicker is this. Maggie's former HOA in Houston was hit with that $2.3 million fine for the same scam. Federal environmental crimes haunt people even when they relocate to other jurisdictions. While Maggie was posting victim status on social media, I was learning that her whole financial house of cards was constructed on fraud. The HOAS construction financing was based on artificially inflated property value, and the banks had insisted on guaranteed access to water before they would approve the loans. If their water rights went back to me, their rightful owner, the whole complex would be financially underwater. The bitter taste of irony wasn't lost on me. They had taken my water and made their land worth something, and now their greed would be the death of them. Maggie panicked. She offered me $400,000 cash, no questions asked, 48-hour deadline. When I refused, she flew to California to approach my sister Sarah with some sob story about her brother's mental health issues. That backfired spectacularly. Sarah might not know Texas land law, but she knows her brother. She called me laughing. Jake. Some lunatic woman in tennis attire just offered to assist with my problematic veteran brother. I told her that if she calls our family again, I'm contacting the FBI. Insurance fraud in development projects typically has criminal sanctions as opposed to civil ones. When you misrepresent to the insurance companies regarding environmental hazards, that's federal mail fraud with obligatory prison time. Rick Thornwell's building firm wasn't only the contractor on the HOA project. He was also the main investor. Each home, constructed on my hijacked property, sent cash directly into his bank account. We had one shot at this! A controlled release at 6 a.m. meant I had to be at the spillway in the dark. Amanda joined me, along with Miguel Santos and Mrs. Chun. As dawn broke, we met Tony Rigg's team. EPA investigators were there too. By 7 a.m., water was flowing. We stood knee-deep in the channel, watching, waiting. By 8 a.m., the flow ramped up. By 10 a.m., we reached peak flow. I felt like an engineer again, not just a farmer. The Army Corps trained me well. At noon, the flow diminished. By 1 p.m., everything looked right. The creek had found its new path. Tony's people collected samples and measurements. We all did interviews, knowing this was only temporary. When the rains came, I'd have to close the spillway again. Amanda filed for an emergency protective order to prevent any further upstream flooding. The last piece was getting the feds to acknowledge that my water rights had been violated, which happened when EPA officials issued a formal complaint against the HOA. Finally, some action. From the media, attention. I got calls from neighboring counties seeking to understand how ID managed to reverse the damage done by Hurricane Harvey. Then came the letter from Amanda. You have prevailed. The feds are stepping in to stop the HOA from further violating your water rights. Additionally, EPA is launching a full investigation into whether the current administration has violated federal lending statutes by guaranteeing construction loans on federally regulated floodplains. Now the feds were on board. The tide had turned. The momentum was on our side. The fight wasn't over, but I knew we'd prevail because I didn't just want to win. I had to. For my sake and for Pop's. The gloves came off. Amanda launched financial warfare. She tipped off insurance firms, had banking regulators examine our loans, and drafted whistleblower complaints regarding Rick's conflicts of interest. The coordination was flawless. Torrential rains within 72 hours, federal inspection the very same week, and agricultural paperwork in place. What was Maggie's anticipated reactions? Emergency HOA meetings, smear campaigns in the press, perhaps a restraining order. Amanda prepared ahead of time legal countermeasures. Preservation of evidence was paramount. Photographs, videos, past documentation, everything submitted to federal court. Safety measures were also addressed. We worked with the volunteer fire department, notified downstream residents, and posted warnings in both English and Spanish. The economic warfare commenced. Amanda alerted state regulators, called the Texas Attorney General regarding insurance fraud, and drafted a civil RICO lawsuit. Coordinated regulatory pressure tends to compel settlements more quickly than isolated suits. In the meantime, I maintained all equipment, tested spillway gates, and supplied the farmhouse with water. Amanda obtained protective court orders, prohibiting interference with legitimate dam operations. Desperation must have reached a level when Maggie had private security hired to patrol our property. Trail cameras captured them attempting to sabotage spillway controls at 2 a.m. Tony had tipped off the sheriff and they were apprehended. Maggie embarked on a media onslaught alleging I threatened children, but surveillance and documentation revealed otherwise. The legal barrage did not cease. Rick rushed an emergency hearing for a restraining order at 6 a.m. Judge Walsh, Rick's golfing pal, was willing to hear it. Amanda requested recusal. Sure, the game was rigged. Maggie coordinated neighborhood watch patrols, intending to live stream the opening of the spillway as environmental terrorism. Meanwhile, Miguel brought 30 farmers and families to testify on behalf of farm water restoration. Two narratives clashed. Veteran attacks, families versus the community, defends water rights. Technical vandalism was raised to a new level. Concrete paste was dumped into the spillway at night. I spent all night with a jackhammer clearing it and taking evidence. Fire Chief Martinez warned me in private that they might be called in 6 hours. Amanda's insurance fraud case stalled HOA development policies. The EPA inspection was advanced 24 hours. Federal agents would witness the spillway opening as evidence of successful water management. At 7:02 a.m., under observation of federal agents, I opened 25% of the spillway gates. Willow Creek started flowing in its original course. Miguel Santos knelt along the reconstituted creek, scooping water in his hands, tears streaming. Maggie shrieked for federal agents to arrest me. EP agent Sarah Kim patiently read that I had every legal right to use my agricultural flood control system. The water wasn't flooding houses. It was flowing precisely where it was supposed to be. Local news helicopters broadcasted live. Downstream farmers regained water access. Mrs. Chun's garden thrived. Some of Maggie's supporters quietly left. Insurance collapse accelerated. Construction work stopped pending fraud investigation. Maggie realized her $2.3 million investment was worthless. City Councilman Martinez made public call for Rick's resignation. Federal agents widened investigation to RICO charges. Maggie cried out, "You've ruined everything!" My reply, "No, ma'am. I restored everything." Community rejoiced. Environmental activists praised spillway operation as a model of ecosystem restoration. In courts, Amanda offered the 1978 Agricultural Flood Control Covenant. EPA testimony, historic photographs, and Tony Riggs' testimony. As an enforcement officer, HOA broke federal environmental regulations, engaged in systematic insurance fraud, and leveled protected wildlife habitat. Rick swore to rapid zoning changes during my overseas deployment and financial interest in the project. Amanda presented taped phone calls documenting the conspiracy. Neighborhood witnesses corroborated the account. Judge Walsh was left no alternative. Granted all restraining orders denied, held spillway operation lawful, and directed HOA to desist from interference with federal investigations. Federal agents escorted Rick as banking investigators served other warrants. Maggie ran away under the protection of reporters. Amanda called for federal RICO investigation at a hastily called press conference. 6 months later, Rick pleaded guilty to federal charges of conspiracy. Maggie was hit with $8.7 million civil fines and bankruptcy. HOA was disbanded. Residents created a new community association dedicated to environmental stewardship. My property value was regained. $340,000 settlement from insurance fraud benefited good causes. Miguel's family ranch came back to him free of debt. Restored creek-lured ecotourism, kayaking, birding, and fishing. Environmental success exceeded all expectations. Protected Guadalupe populations rebounded, birds returned, and the creek became a wildlife corridor. We funded a water rights legal defense fund. Children swam in the creek where houses were to be constructed. Every Sunday, I take creek water to Pop's grave in a little mason jar. He loved this creek, and he loved this place. And I just wanted to share that with you. The good news is the watershed where we're sitting is now protected. The development rights are owned by Willow Creek Conservation Trust, so no one can develop this land now or in the future. The bad news is Maggie's HOA. They were federally RICO prosecuted, but there's hope there too. Because 147 families in 3 different states are suing to get their water rights back. One soldier's struggle became a national movement. And I'm sitting here on my porch, looking out over the Willow Creek stream, reminding myself and you that sometimes you need to fill the valley to preserve the creek, but you don't do it by yourself. You do it with your neighbors, you do it with your community, and you do it with those who believe that clean water is for everybody. So document everything. Look for allies! The law is on our side when we protect the land for the people in the future. Water will find a way. Justice will find a way. Willow Creek runs wild, y'all. And it always will.